It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our lunch speaker today, who's going to give us the benefit of his insights. Michael Piore is one of my intellectual heroes. He's the model of a scholar who's been engaged with the real world through his career, and most importantly, I think, in terms of the conversation that we had this morning, he represents the potential for economics and economists to transcend, what have often been the limits of the discipline, and essentially embrace a broader vision in which we're not just talking about abstract models, but we're talking about real human beings who are subjects of the story.
I want to start with the observation that that this conference, and more particularly the background papers around which it's organized, constitute a radical shift in the tone and tenor of the technology policy debate. That shift is away from what Fred calls market fundamentalism towards a call for an active government involvement in the management of the economy. This shift is rapidly becoming pervasive in all areas of government policy and all aspects of economic activity. Indeed, it's actually less dramatic in the area of technology policy than many other areas, the tone of the paper notwithstanding. The real message of the background paper is that the government is already involved in a very fundamental way in technology policy, and what is really required is much greater consciousness and of its role, and a much more deliberate approach to what is now a rather dispersed set of activities. But while in this case the tone may belie the substance, the tone does herald the emergence of a very general shift, one which is taking place across the policy spectrum in areas ranging from social policy to credit policy, and even to the minutiae of wage setting and compensation. And it is to the general problems posed by the shift that I want to try and speak here, although I'm going to try and illustrate my remarks by reference to technology policy specifically. First, I think it's useful to recognize where the shift is coming from. The most dramatic impetus for it at the moment is the economic crisis, and I'm sure that we will come to think of it as associated with the election of President Obama. But it actually reflects, I think, a much longer-term reevaluation of the market and the reaction against its impact on the texture of social relations. That reaction has been underway for some time, particularly in Latin America and Europe, but even in the United States, the extreme inequality in the distribution of income, which has been increasing, particularly at the upper tail, for the last 30 years, and our failure to address energy and environmental issues have been kind of developing in the long term, a kind of questioning about the market, and the sense that perhaps after all it may not be necessary, that we may not have to pay in these areas of social policy and energy policy for rapid economic growth. Thus, I would submit the issues here are really not going to go away, and we need to think exactly in a deep sense about what it means to turn away from the market. Second, I think it is important to recognize the underlying nature of the shift in the tenor of the debate which is taking place, because the nature and its framing have a big impact on how we think about the problems posed by the shift. And here I think the use of the term market fundamentalism to describe the orientation towards public policy away from which we are moving is misleading. It is misleading first because it implies that the orientation was a kind of ideological commitment which was confined to one particular part of the political spectrum. But second, it's misleading because it implies a reification of market outcomes, notwithstanding Fred's efforts to combat such reification in his own work. Both implications are, I believe, wrong. In point of fact, there's been a strong commitment across a very broad swath of the political spectrum to the competitive market as a model for organizing economic and even social activity. It has been accompanied by a belief that behavior is most effectively monitored and directed in the way that we talk about it in the competitive market models, that is to say, by individual monetary incentives. This has not necessarily meant an acceptance of market outcomes, particularly on the left, but it has meant, even on the left, that there is a strong, perhaps the better word is overwhelming presumption in favor of the market as a means of organizing economic activities, and a kind of feeling that you should correct for the market after the fact through tax and transfer policy and not intervene directly in the market itself. Moreover, and in terms of the situation we face today, more importantly, we have sought to solve all problems posed in both the public and the private sphere by increasing the role and scope of competitive market forces, primarily through deregulation and expanded international trade, but also through simulated market mechanisms in structuring compensation, incentives, and government regulatory systems when we have been forced in the end to preserve the government itself. In this sense, the attraction of cap and trade and environmental policy, incentive pay for teachers based on the test scores of their students, and auctions and reverse auctions in the allocation of the radio spectrum or mortgage bailout funds are all of a piece. The problem here is not that these solutions are wrong or even inappropriate. The problem is rather that we have focused exclusively on this range of solutions. And in the process, we've completely neglected other approaches in addressing the failings of government and indeed of private institutions, other approaches which might provide different or grow out of different models of social behavior and provide different models for managing organizational forms and organizational structures. The net result is that the revival of interest in government operations is taking place in an intellectual vacuum. And we need to think about how to fill that intellectual vacuum, even as we are forced by events to undertake precisely the kinds of government interventions which we really do not have the understanding which would be required to organize them effectively. The roles which government is being called upon to play, and hence the intellectual vacuum which our preoccupation with the market has created, are, I would submit, twofold. First, we need the government to create the broad framework in which particular actions, both public and private, are conceived. And second, we often need the government for various reasons to actually undertake those actions. Specific actions cannot always be delegated to the private sector. While both of these are very general problems, I want to illustrate at least the first in terms of technology policy. And for doing that, I'm going to draw on the book which Fred mentioned, called Innovation, the Missing Dimension, which is based on a series of case studies which we conducted over the course of a rather long 10-year period of the organization of product design and development. We looked at three industries, primarily cellular phones, blue jeans, and medical devices, but we also interviewed a number of practitioners in other industries and our colleagues who taught design and development at MIT. What emerged from that study was that design and development really involves two very fundamentally different activities. One of those activities is what the engineers call analysis, and it basically is looking at problems the way in which we teach people to look at them in economics and management, but also the way in which people are taught to think about them in engineering. And it's essentially problem solving or analysis, carefully specifying the goals, identifying alternative designs for achieving the goals, seeking to optimize the designs in the light of the goals, and picking the optimum from among alternatives that you've looked at. This process is fostered by competition and competitive pressures, and it's aided by individual monetary incentives. But the original product ideas, the designs which you are ultimately analyzing, come out of a very different process. That process we called interpretation. And if it's not well managed, you can optimize all you want, but you're optimizing around a set of product ideas for which there's not likely to be a market. So so you need to create something, a background out of which these ideas emerge. And that background grows out of and is developed in intense discussion and debate within a community of engineers, scientists, and managers who can speak to each other in a common language, and who, moreover, share an understanding of the world of the customer or consumer and can translate and interpret the world in which the technology is developed into the very different medium in which customers and consumers operate. The first step in this process is building such a community. Thus, in the cellular case, in the case of cellular telephones, the cellular industry was created out of a marriage of radio and television, telephone technology. Two completely different engineering traditions and completely different business cultures. And this group of engineers had to develop a product which people only had the vaguest idea initially of what was going to be for, even in the futurist tradition out of which they were working, and which had to sell to a set of consumers who initially never saw the product or used it. And in the end, that community had to follow those consumers as they moved from a product that was designed to sit in a car on the model of a taxi radio or a police radio to the small handheld device that we know and love today. Okay, so you had to really build a community among those diverse elements. And this required a set of managerial skills which were completely different from the analytical skills which the engineers in management learned in their education. We liken these skills to those of a host or hostess at a cocktail party, selecting the right people, encouraging them to talk to each other, keeping the conversation going, preventing it from breaking apart over disagreements and misunderstandings, enriching it with new people when it flagged. It is a process that is really stifled by competition, because competition promotes secrecy and independence. Interpretation thus required not only a different skills, but a very different organizational environment from that of analysis. Many of the managers with whom we talked recognized this different function, at least instinctively and intuitively, but they lacked the vocabulary with which to talk about it and had enormous difficulty articulating what they did in practice, and had trouble holding their own in a world which was dominated by the vocabulary of analysis. Partly as a result, the space within the private sector in which was once sheltered from competition and where these interpretive communities developed were being progressively eliminated. For example, the large corporate laboratories, in the case of cellular phones, Bell Labs, no longer really exist in the way they did before. This has placed increasing importance on other institutions which were sheltered from competition, particularly the universities of government, and where these formative conversations could take place. But in these other institutions, too, the sheltering function is being compromised by the introduction of simulated market incentives in budgeting and compensation policies, which with potentially devastating consequences for American innovation. And the interchange about intellectual property and the response of the dean of the business school at Davis is indicative of the kind of tensions which are leading the university away from its ability to play the function which it has in the past and needs even more so now to play in the innovation process. What I would like to suggest is that new government mechanisms we are creating in technology, but in more proactive government policy in general, are very much like interpretive communities in product development. In the case of technology policy, the analogy is complete because technology policy is about creating and evaluating innovation. And many of the background papers for today's workshop speak to this point, albeit implicitly by describing and documenting the government's role not only in creating such communities, but in sheltering them from the perils of the competitive market. I thus agree with Fred and his colleagues that if the government is effectively to create and manage the evolution of the interpretive communities here, we need to increase the visibility of the federal government in this area and its ability to command the discussion and debate. At the very least, this involves reinforcing the position and importance of the President's scientific advisor in the White House and the ability of Congress to enter into and augment the debate through something like a revival of the Office of Technological Assessment. We may indeed need to go further, and as the background paper argues, actually create a cabinet-level Department of Technology Policy. But the role of the government in orchestrating the discussion and debate about technology policy is not the end of the story. Very often, and increasingly in the future it would appear, the government will not only be called upon to create the framework in which the policy is thought about, it will also actually have to undertake the actions which implement technology policy by direct support of research and development, and even in the investments which bring technology to market. And I think you can see the role of the government in these areas if you look at the various areas in which the government has been active, national security, the CIA, that is the DARPA, the CIA, NIH, and increasingly the National Science Foundation, and increasingly in energy policy. So this brings us to the second dimension of the intellectual vacuum, which our obsession with the market over the last 30 years has left in its wake. How do we manage government organizations when they themselves must not only create the broad community of understanding in which action is conceived, but also undertake those actions themselves? We have tended to conceive of this problem by analogy with the Manhattan Project, or with the effort to place a man on the moon, and where this is the case, there is a very close analogy to how large companies developed, in the past at least, and pursued, for example, cellular telephones, and we can borrow heavily from the private sector in organizing the public sector. But in point of fact, most of the technology projects we are talking about in national security and defense and health and safety and so on involve a portfolio of projects, each project of which is relatively small. Decisions about which of these projects to support are delegated to program officers and project managers in, as I said before, the CIA, DARPA, NIH, and the National Science Foundation. It appears that the technical solutions to our energy problem are also going to involve a portfolio of projects. So the question emerges, how do you manage these program officers who are the key to the operation of the technology policy? how are those decisions are going to be made, and how do you direct or stable, if you will, of the key agents in this process. If the mechanisms derived from the competitive market are not appropriate, what mechanisms are? Here it appears that we are forced to move beyond models of economic behavior and to see the way in which even economic behavior is rooted in social processes and interpretive communities as these are understood by anthropologists and sociologists. These interpretive communities are like language communities, and people come to understand themselves and conceive their identity as rooted in them. A new literature on the network economy upon which the background papers draw grows out of this insight, but ultimately the key decisions in the network studies literature are made by private actors and not government agents. Okay, most of the relevant literature, most of what is relevant here is a much older literature on professional communities and what is called street-level bureaucracies. Street-level bureaucracies are organizations in which an enormous discretion lies at the base of the bureaucratic hierarchy in the line officers. So policemen on the beat, school teachers, child welfare caseworkers, forest rangers, and DARPA program managers, and those at NIH and the National Science Foundation. What motivates and directs these line officers in these organizations is precisely the fact that their personal identities are rooted not only in the roles which they play in the organization, but also in the way in which they are viewed and understood in their professional or quasi-professional communities. A lot of attention was once paid to this type of organization, but the literature on this organization came to a complete halt in roughly 1980 when we became infatuated with the market, and there's really very little which has been written since. The key study in this literature is a study of the U.S. Forest Service and the way in which the forest rangers as agents are managed. But what this literature suggests, or suggested, or was suggesting when it was kind of aborted, is that the decisions of these line officers are based on a tacit knowledge or tacit rules. That knowledge grows out of and is embedded in an organizational culture. And to manage these kinds of organizations, what you need to do are really two fundamental things. One is to surface the tacit knowledge so that it becomes the subject of debate and discussion, and the other is to learn to manage the organizational culture by who is recruited into the organization, by the training which the members of the organization get, by the discussion and debate about policy which occurs within the organization. And this, I would submit, is what we need to learn how to do in order to build the guts, not only of technological policy, but of all the interventions which we are now making through government bureaucracies into the economy. And you can see that is the emergence of these communities in two very, very public processes that we have been observing recently. One is the process of the bailout, the financial bailout itself, since that process is going to be judged by the line officers of an organization we're creating that's going to make those loans and decide ultimately how that money is dispensed. And so you can see a new community emerging as people in the kind of elements of it as people move out of the government into the private sector as this administration comes to an end, and people from the private sector are pulled into the government. And so the question is going to be, how is this community, are the tacit rules this community is developing? How are we as a public going to gain some control and leverage on the evolution of that process? And you can see it also in a very different area in the issue of the federal prosecutors in the Justice Department, which have been the subject of so much attention in the last year. The decisions of these agents in regional offices, that is the public prosecutors, involve no less the picking of winners and losers than would the decisions of agents managing an active government policy. But in contrast to the scorn which is heaped on such powers in the debate about industrial policy, nobody has suggested that the power we give to federal prosecutors is inappropriate or even undesirable. Presumably that is in no small measure because, as the former Attorney General Gonzales learned, that power is ultimately exercised in a framework of standards which, however tacit, are nonetheless stringent and real, and which government officials violate at their peril. Moreover, while the goals that Gonzales was trying to pursue were questionable, and the way he went about it in the end proved unsuccessful, the attempt to judge the performance of government agents and to exercise direction and control over public policy which grows out of their actions in this domain is exactly what we want to be able to do in other domains as well. It is towards this end that we need to learn from the experiences which we find ourselves all of a sudden and on so many different fronts engaged. Lest you conclude from these comments that we should wait to launch these new policy initiatives until we actually know how to manage them effectively, let me say a word about the current climate in which we are formulating public policy and why it is forcing us to learn on the fly. It is now clear, I think, that we are entering a period comparable to the Great Depression. It may not be as profound and prolonged as the Great Depression itself. Certainly nobody is willing to say out loud that this is likely to be so. But it will certainly be a period in which the mechanisms that normally govern economic activity are frozen in a way in which they were frozen in the Great Depression, and as a result in which there is massive unemployment, not only of labor, but of capital equipment, raw materials, indeed of virtually every and all kinds of productive assets. Such a period is one in which the laws of economics are suspended. Indeed, to the very limited extent we understand a period of this kind, those laws are inverted. Economics is concerned with scarcity, limited resources in the face of unlimited desires. That, in fact, is the textbook definition of economics as a science. And it is preoccupied with the efficiency of resource use because the cost of inefficiency is in other unmet needs and wants. But the unemployment characteristic of a depression of this kind signals that resources are not scarce. They are, from an economic point of view, essentially free. If they are not absorbed by government, they will not be used at all. They will simply go to waste. In this sense, the constraints on government spending are lifted. We do not need to think of energy programs taking place at the expense of something else. I think it is also fair to say that we are learning something else about a depression, and that is that the private sector is frozen. And while we haven't really talked much about what's happening to investment in technology at the moment, if it's anything like the other sectors of the economy, the kind of investment which was taking place even 6 months ago is not going to take place. And so it's not a question really of government substituting for the private sector. It's a question substituting in the sense of squeezing out the private sector. It is that the government, at least temporarily, has to take on the functions which the private sector previously performed. And if we want to have an energy policy which lays the groundwork for the long run, we need to have the government fill in the gaps which are being left by the private sector. All right, I'd like to make one last comment, which I think is important. Operating in a world of this kind presents all sorts of problems for government decision-making. But among the most difficult of those problems is that of how to preserve a concern for efficiency and efficacy in such a world. We need to preserve that sense, not because resources at the moment are scarce, but in part because we're presumably not always going to be living in a world of this kind. Presumably at some point we'll surmount the crisis and return to this world of scarcity where we need to use resources in an efficient and effective manner. But we need to be especially concerned in this way with in energy and environmental policy, because while resources are not the constraint which they would be under normal circumstances, time most certainly is. The security of the country and the fate of the planet hinge on how quickly we can develop technologies which effectively answer the problems in this area. Energy and development and environmental technology are not post office murals. Hence, we have a special problem here, a problem of preserving the criteria of efficiency in an environment which encourages us to suspend those criteria. So to conclude, we face a double challenge in the current period, a challenge in which conventional economics is doubly suspended. Suspended first because the framework in which we understand and prescribe effective organizational forms no longer operates, and we need to develop the instruments for understanding and evaluating these forms, but also suspended because the scarcity which defines economics itself doesn't exist. We need, as a result, to be especially attentive to learning lessons on the fly from the experiences in which we are directly engaged. But particularly in energy policy, we cannot afford to let this period, when resource constraints are lifted, distract us from the task of learning how to deploy the resources which are in use effectively and efficiently. Thank you.